Support for this show, Politics Done Right, comes from politicsdoneright.com, publishers of How to Make America Utopia, Take Away the Economy from Those Who Rigged It, As I See It, Class Warfare, The Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom, It's Worth It, How to Talk to Your Right-Wing Relatives, Friends, and Neighbors, and other books written by Egberto, Willies. Welcome to another edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto, Willies, your host. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Reverend William J. Barber II. He's an American Protestant minister who has spent every effort to ensure that poor and working class Americans realize they are already empowered to create a fair and a just society. He's the president of Repairers of the Breach, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, and the architect of Moral Mondays. He is what America needs right now. Reverend Barber, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, and thank you so much. I love the title of your show, Politics Done Right, because, politics is something we have to do. It's not a passive endeavor, and we have to seek to do the right thing. And for me as a minister, right and righteousness, justice and love all go together, in particular how we treat the least of these. So let me thank you for this invitation and for all that you do through this show.
Well, look, it is my pleasure, Dr. Barber. Let me tell you, I met you in D.C. a few years ago when you marched from that whole march from the South right up into D.C. I don't recall what the name of it is right now, but it was a huge march with people walking straight up. Do you remember that?
Yeah, the mass moral, it was called the Poor People's Low Wage Workers Mass Moral March on Washington People's Assembly and to the polls. And actually, the reports were that there were tens of thousands of people from all over the country, some 40 denominational groups, some 300 other organizations, and 2.5 million people tuned in online because, we're still doing some of the ending parts of work over is still here, but we had to be very careful. We had intended that gathering to be in 2020, and we did online until 2022. And out of that, we launched a massive campaign to mobilize poor and low-wage voters in 12 states, touched about 2.6 million poor and low-wage voters, and the metrics came back to show that those voters had major impact on political progressive victories, throughout the country. And I think if you remember on that day, the first 100 minutes were all people impacted speaking. It wasn't people speaking for people, which is our model in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Reverend Liz Steele Harris is a co-chair, and I constantly emphasize that the greatest, most powerful moral voices are the impacted people themselves who live every day in this country, who face the injustices but still believe that transformation is possible.
That is so powerful. Dr. Barber, as I was doing some research on what we're going to talk about, because I'm really interested in those who are getting the people that have been left out of our economy to actually participate. They have a voice. And I came across something that you wrote right after I think the Supreme Court got rid of any practical version of the affirmative action. It was called, and you wrote it at Yale, it was called A Moral Declaration of America on our shared task of building the nation that's never yet been. That title said it all. The first paragraph you have, you said, one miraculous day, all Americans may rise to the moral mandate of obeying the unforceable natural law that all humans are created equal and that we each have the right to enjoy the earth. But until then, all we have is this American democracy to protect people against oppression, domination, and man-made evil systems that value riches over lives are our laws derived from our Constitution. It's a very long document, but the preamble says it all. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, every now and then we need to go back, as Martin King said, to what we've said on paper and what our democracy is built on And as Langston Hughes said, America has never been America to me, but I swear this oath that America shall be. And one of the reasons we say that is because there's certain things that we said. And now, when they were written, they didn't apply it to everybody, but we must demand that they be applied today. For instance, it is in our Declaration of Independence that we said everybody have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have to ask the question, what does that mean in this moment? What is hindering life? So if poverty is the fourth leading cause of death in the most opulent country, wealthiest country in the world, then that is a violation of our declaration, right? We didn't just want independence. We declared a certain kind of independence, that it would be for life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. We go to our Constitution and we say that the whole purpose of government, the establishment of government, is to establish justice. Well, what does that mean? What is established justice in this century? What does it mean not just to pray for justice, believe in justice, but to literally establish it, to make it firm? And so when you look around and you see, for instance, that a congressperson can get elected to office and they get free health care just because they got elected, but then that same congressperson can block Americans from getting health care, that's not established justice. That's established injustice. When we look at the fact that we have less voting rights today than we had August 6, 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed in Section 5, pre-clearance, that said states couldn't just operate on their own. They had to have their laws pre-cleared to make sure they weren't perpetuating racism. To gut the Voting Rights Act, to throw it into the Congress and tell the Congress to fix it. And Democrats nor Republicans have fixed that Voting Rights Act for now 10, 11 years. That's not established justice. That's established injustice. And if you look at each principle, those principles should be laid like a grid on top of our current reality. We say that the goal of our country is to provide for the common defense. Well, we didn't defend essential workers during COVID. We told them they were essential, but then we treated them like they were expendable. We didn't ensure that when they went to work, they had paid family, they had insurance, they had health insurance, they had living wages. We say in our preamble, in our Constitution, we are to promote the general welfare. That is, and by the way, welfare is a constitutional word. We've actually taken that word from our public discussion as though welfare is some evil word, but it's in the Constitution. And it says everybody's welfare, where 87 million people are uninsured or underinsured. If 58 senators can do what they did in 2020 and block 52 million people who make less than a living wage of $15 an hour from receiving that minimum wage. Literally 58 senators said no to 52 million people, while they themselves have gotten all kinds of raises. When we've not raised the minimum wage since 2009, that's 15 years. It's at $7.25. There's not a state in this country where poor and somebody making $7.25 can afford a basic two-bedroom apartment. We're not promoting the general welfare. And then lastly, in that article, I wanted to point out in long form that we also say that we believe that establishing justice, providing for the common defense, and promoting the general welfare are essential to domestic tranquility. In other words, we cannot have peace. People can't say, well, let's have peace in the nation. Well, peace must grow out of established justice. It must grow out of a provided general welfare. It must grow out of providing for the common defense. It's not just peace in words. It must be peace in practice, and that peace must be connected to justice.
I mean, you nailed it. I mean, and we know that a lot of the problems that we have today, it's sort of built on the divide and conquer tenet. In other words, we know most Americans want the same thing, but the only way you can get them to keep their eyes off the ball is to have them believe there are differences that really don't exist
Right.
among them. Is that right?
I call them micro divisions and deflections. And what we need to understand is this is not a Trump creation or a recent creation.
Mm-hmm.
You can track it all the way down to the American reality, but let me track it from one place. In 1965, 66, and there's a powerful book that all of your audience ought to read called A Time of Illusion, where an author actually goes in and investigates and unpacks the goal of the so-called Southern strategy. It was right in the height of the peace movement. It was in the height of the women's movement and in the height of the civil rights movement and the youth movement that these Southern Dixiecrats got together. And it was not long after Richard Nixon was going to run for president. And they said to him, we know how to win. And this is how we have to win. We must engage in intentional, positive polarization. We must make sure that these various groups split, that they see each other as adversaries. We must use the anger against the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the peace movement, and turn people against each other. And they said, and we must start in the South and Southwest, from Maryland all the way over to Nevada. And out of that, we can create, they said, a new rising. We must paint the Democratic Party as the, quote, black party, the giveaway party. And we must make sure that the hope that many had of masses of Negro people and poor, low-wage white people coming together and forming a political power block does not happen. Then they said, if we get caught, we'll lie. And they said, and it's probably going to get out of control, and we'll lie and say we didn't do it. But if we engage in this positive polarization, not only can we split the South, we can split the ethnic enclaves of the North. And then we play our game in that division. This was actually a plan, right? So, and if you don't know this, then you think that Trump is somehow just came on the scene, or the MAGA Republicans came on the scene. And by the way, almost entire Republican Party bought into this, and everyone has used it. Nixon used it. Reagan used it. Bush 1 and 2 used it. They've all used it. And too often, moderate Democrats have used it as well and succumbed to it. You remember a minute ago I said that 8 senators voted against 52 million Americans. 8 of those were so-called moderate Democrats.
Right.
You think about that now.
Right.
50 were Republicans. And 50. So this divide and conquer that you just mentioned is a strategy. I love it the way that a scholar out of Emory says. She says what we are seeing today is an iconography of a too often American reality.
Wow.
We cannot act as though what we are seeing is like nuance. It's like it's something that's brand new. Is just one person. If we do our analysis that way, we are missing the entire function of what's going on. Right.
Exactly. You nailed it. Let me ask you something, Reverend Barber, because first of all, I want to qualify something that you said when you mentioned about they attempted to turn the Democratic Party into having many Americans believe it's the Black Party, and above and beyond that somehow it's the Welfare Party. And interestingly, a lot of the supporters of the right, or let's say in the entire Appalachian Trails, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, all these places that fall within the Appalachian Trails, where a large percentage of the white people in there have a much higher percentage of welfare usage. In fact, there's a video that I was suggesting that people look that said 50% of certain areas in West Virginia, the people are on government support. Not that it's a good thing, but the idea is it's amazing how much they vote against your interests. A lot of what you are doing, I noticed for some time now, is bringing all these people together to make them realize, no, we are all in the same boat and we're being played. Go ahead, Doctor.
Well, I spent a lot of time in Appalachia, just like we do in the South. My grandfather was from West Virginia. He was a coal miner that worked along other white coal miners in the 1920s in what was called the Blair Mountain Wars, when the miners stood up against the bosses and the government, and they had Molotov cocktails dropped on them from biplanes. So there is this history of fusion movement, even in Appalachia. You know, the song that the Black Lives Matter movement sang a lot, "Which Side Are You On? Which Side Are You On?" actually came from Appalachia. It came from East Kentucky. A white woman there was singing that song as they were trying to arrest her husband, who was a miner who took on the bosses. Let me do a little bit of a reframe on what was just said. And at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, Dr. King stood on the steps of that Alabama State House and said, the greatest fear of the racist aristocracy in this country is for the masses of Negro people and the masses of poor white people to come together and form a voting bloc that could fundamentally shift the economic architecture. He actually said that. I think that's one of the reasons, he eventually was killed, because 3 years later he was gone, because he was putting this together, right? Now, here we are today. Let me make a couple of corrections that are often repeated, but they're not true today. One is that welfare, actually, as we know it, is a good thing, even what grew out of the New Deal and others, because without it, we had 140 million poor and low wealth people. Without assistance in 2019, without assistance, it would be much worse, right? And the reason why we have to have the assistance is because the systems don't do the things that need to be done for people to exist, like making sure people have a living wage and have health care. But however, let me take one other step. Did you know that the fact of the matter is most poor and low-wage white people do not vote against their own self-interest? When the insurrection happened, immediately some people started saying, "Oh, that's just a bunch of poor, uneducated white people." But when they did the analysis, who made up that crowd, it was mostly middle and upper class white folk and extremists. Because the truth of the matter is, we did an analysis study called "Waking the Sleeping Giant," and this is what we found with the scholars doing the research. Most poor and low-wage folk don't vote, period. They don't vote.
I get it.
One reason they don't vote is, you see what I'm saying? The number one reason they don't vote is because nobody talks to them. The last time I was in Harlan County, Kentucky, which is where Lyndon Baines Johnson launched the war on poverty. It's East Kentucky. We went there and spent 2 or 3 days in the campaign. They told me a presidential candidate had not been back there since then. Nobody talks to them.
Reverend Barber.
Back there don't vote.
Reverend Barber, you just opened my eyes to something that I have to add to my narrative and stop. I mean, first of all, I'd never thought about it that way. Actually, most don't vote against your interests. So wow, that is insightful. Right. Please continue. But I mean, it just kind of rung a bell when you expressed it that way. Go ahead, my friend.
Right. Well, I've written a book called White Poverty: The Lies and Myths that have been told that continue to exacerbate division between the races. It's coming out in June. And it's for this very purpose. I take a sympathetic look at poor, low wage white people as an African American. I have mixed root, but I'm an African American, and it was startling what I found. I found out that not only have we lied, we told damn lies about what's really going on, and it's used to keep that coalition See, if you can teach people that white people are voting against their own self-interest, then black people say, well, we blame everything on poor white folk. Then you teach poor white folk that black folk are somehow taking things from them, and you create the division. But the metrics, the numbers show us that most poor and low-wage white people, most poor and low-wage people, period, don't vote against their own interests. They don't vote. And the number one reason they don't vote is nobody talks to them. Now, what does that leave us? There are 87 million poor and low-wage eligible voters in this country today. 87 million. Some eligible. Some registered, who actually registered. Of those registered, some 30 million voted, and some 40 million voted. Some 20 plus million did not vote. So people vote, but they're not voting their power. Secondly, what we now know is that there's not a state in this country where poor and low wealth folk make up less than 30% of the electorate.
Wow.
In so-called battleground states, it's over 40%, where the margin of victory was within 3% in a presidential race. Now, lastly, we also now know through our study that there's not a so-called battleground state where if 20% of poor and low-wage voters who have not voted were to vote, they could not control the election and close any margin of gap. And in many places, it's under 5%. Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin are all under 5%, where you may have, for instance, a presidential election decided by 10,000 votes, but poor and low-wage workers that didn't vote equal 1 million voters.
Wow.
In North Carolina, the last time in 2016, it was 900,000 poor and low-wage voters that could have voted that didn't vote, but the margin of victory in president was only 160,000 votes. Now, why is it that people aren't voting? Well, if you look at our debates, the way they're set up in this country, 40+% of the people in this country are poor and low wealth. Over 135 million people today, 52 million people less than living wage, 87 million people uninsured or underinsured. When's the last time you've heard a presidential debate deal with those issues?
Right.
You don't hear it. So people don't hear themselves talk about it. We had 15 presidential debates in 2020. Not one 15 minutes, not one 5 minutes was spent on poverty and low wages. So if somebody turns on the TV, all they hear us talking about is who called who, a name, how many wives somebody has, who's going to put tax cuts for the middle class tax cuts. You see what I'm saying? They never hear. We don't force these candidates to say, if you become president, what are you going to do with living wages? What are you going to do about health care for all? What are you going to do to address the issue of 40-some% of the nation being poor and low wealth? So people turn off. What we're saying, though, to this crowd is if you want to be heard, you've got to make them. If you want to be talked to, you've got to make them hear you. And you've got this power. Poor and low-wage voters now are the sleeping giant. Because so many people are poor and low wealth, we now have this power. Poor and low wealth people, religious and moral leaders, people without a faith who believe in the moral arc of the universe, and allies can actually mobilize. And so on March the 2nd, in 32 states plus the District of Columbia, we are launching the Mass Moral March on state assemblies by poor and low-wage people and their allies. We're launching a effort to mobilize, to touch, and call to action 15 million poor and low-wage voters in those states over 42 weeks, with the understanding that we need a resurrection and not an insurrection. We need to poor and low-wage people must engage. We cannot sit back and say we don't have power. We must engage, and this power must be felt. Lastly, we really don't know in this country what a battleground state is, or what a red state is, or what a blue state is, because so much has been done to depress the voting population from participation. If poor and low wage voters engage, all of our concepts about what is red and blue and right state and conservative they go out the window.
Think about Mississippi, what it would do, right? Mississippi would no longer be a red state. It's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, perhaps.
And you're talking about where now in Mississippi, 60% of Republicans want Medicaid expansion and health care. If you look, however, at the number of poor and low-wage voters in Mississippi that have not engaged, if just somewhere around 25-30% of those would engage, they could change the margin of victory for president and for the Senate and for the governorship. Imagine if a presidential candidate or a senator went to Mississippi and says, if I get elected, my administration is going to raise your wages to a living wage. It's going to ensure everybody here has you have health care. I mean, think about what that would do to change the whole. What if we had presidential debates and these issues were fully discussed? Well, it's not going to happen until these voters show their power in an election and force people to have to talk to them.
Dr. Barber, before I ask you the last question, I want to postulate something here, and you tell me if you agree. I think the reason we don't go there is that both the Republican Party and, let's call it, for lack of a better term, the neoliberal portion of the Democratic Party are pretty much there as the guardian gates of the rich. And in so doing, they, even at the neoliberal democratic side, there's just so far they're willing to go as far as providing the type of economy that we really need.
Well, I will say this. When Jesus preached his first sermon, and declared that he was come to preach good news to the poor, the Patokos, the PTCHOS, and he preached it in the ghetto of Nazareth, it says that day they tried to kill him. The power structure tried to shut it down. When Pope Francis has said in his writings that there's an evil magic, he calls it social magic, that exists in both trickle-down economics and neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. Neither one of them addressed the most fundamental issue of how we live from the bottom, poor and low-wage folk. If you look at it, Dr. King said in the letter from the Birmingham jail that moderates were the worst enemy of the civil rights movement.
Yes, he said that.
From jail. People who are more interested in keeping things in order than doing transformation. And the corporate wing, if you think about it, there was an article that came out when Manchin and Sinema voted against the John Lewis voting bill, and the article said that they got that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce basically called them and said, "Okay, there are two things we don't want you voting for: voting rights and living wages." And the so-called religious right, what we call religious nationalism, there's a book out that talks about shadow money, and it says that basically they are undergirded by the oil barons of this country, and that the whole religious nationalism piece is basically a function of certain aspects of corporate America. And so, yes, you're exactly right. Too many are tied into what they treat corporations like people and people like things. Even the Supreme Court justices, if you look at their records, the ones that got put on by McConnell and Trump and all, the one area that all of them almost 100% vote on and have ruled on from the bench is the expansion of corporate power.
Right.
The expansion of corporate power. You think about the country. We're in a country that gave corporations the right to put unlimited amounts of shadow money into the election, but then roll back voting rights.
Right.
But even with that, my friend, even with that, this is what we're saying to poor and low wealth for. All of this is true. And all of this has happened. But even with that, we still have this power that has not been fully used. And it's a sleeping giant that has to be waked. If you disagree with all that I just said, then poor and low wage folk are going to have to vote. They're going to have to vote, and they're not just, and their votes can't be for personalities. Their votes have to be demands.
Right.
We're voting, and we're demanding, and that's why March we're gathering, 42 weeks. Then we're coming to D.C. on June the 15th to launch the summer effort. We're doing all this before the conventions and say, if you want these votes, then you need to talk to these folks. You need to be very clear about where you stand on voting rights, living wages, and what you're going to do in the first 50 days. Not what you have done, but if you get power, what you're going to do in the first 50 days, because people are tired of being played with. And as Fannie Lou Hamer says, when you get sick and tired of being sick and tired, you have to use all the power that you have. And in a democracy, poor and low wage folk and moral leaders and others have to recognize you cannot leave power on the table when you actually have the power to determine electoral outcomes. You just can't do it.
Dr. Barber, I don't remember if it was the Netroots Nation in Arizona or the Netroots Nation in Providence, one of the Netroots Nations. You came out and gave the speech on the third Reconstruction. And I taped that speech that you gave. Hell of a speech. Are we considering this now the extension of the third Reconstruction, what you're working on with the campaign to get these people to engage?
Yes, the third Reconstruction is I believe, the only hope for this democracy. We had two Reconstructions, one in the 1800s and one in the 1960s. Both of them were killed, assassinated, politically undermined. The first one in the 1800s, there was a compromise made to give the South back to the extremists in 1877. The second Reconstruction in the 1960s was undone by, the assassination of so many, and then the Southern strategy. So we never finished those. We need a third Reconstruction in this country that completes what a democracy should look like fully constructed. And that would mean a democracy where poverty is abolished, where you do not have the ability to say poverty is the fourth leading cause of death. But that's where we are now. We need a third Reconstruction that eradicates that. It should shock everybody to say poverty alone is the fourth leading cause of death in this country, higher than homicide, higher than respiratory disease. A third Reconstruction democracy says we had Reconstruction that said put in place a minimum wage, but now we need a living minimum wage for everybody, because $7.25 an hour and $2.13 an hour for people that work in the restaurant industry is immoral, ungodly, and unjust. And if you go down the line, a third Reconstruction means a society where everybody has access to basic human rights and basic civil rights. Health care ought to be a human and a civil right. Fully funded public education, a human and a civil right. Women's right to their health, a human right and civil right. Living wages, minimum living wages, human rights and civil rights. The right to clean water, clean environment. This is what a third Reconstruction vision looks like. And the point is to tell people we have the power to build it. We have the power to build it. People sitting in office today are not insurmountable. They are not
infallible.
Without them, you can overcome that. They don't have to be there. We can determine electoral outcomes, and it also means we have to have a movement that both moves in the electoral process and then stays engaged and stays engaged. I said the other day, and I'll close with this, to Senator Schumer, I was talking to him, and I said, Senator, you the chair, we need a hearing right now in the U.S. Senate on passing a living wage of at least $15 to $17 an hour minimum wage, which is actually 60 years old. Because, at the March on Washington, they wanted a minimum wage of $2 an hour indexed with inflation, which means it would be about $18 or $19 today if we had done
Right.
6-some years ago. But anyway, and I said to him, and he said to me, well, I don't know if I have the vote. I said, if the Democratic Party doesn't have the votes in the Senate to pass a living wage, then they need to be replaced. Not by Republicans, but they need to be replaced by
progressives. Yes, absolutely.
Who will not say that kind of foolishness. I said, we need the hearing, we need a vote. Whether if the House, if Speaker Johnson won't pass it, force him to have to deal with it, and then go to the polls and say to people, if you elect us in the first 50 days, not the first 100 days, we'll do three basic things. We'll restore fully voting rights, we'll pass a living wage for all workers, and we will guarantee health care. If those three things, and do you know, lastly, the things that we're pushing, there are about 7 pieces of legislation that if they were pushed and passed, that most Americans agree with in terms of 60-70%, it would pretty much eradicate poverty and low wage in this country. A third Reconstruction says we must get it done, and poor and low wage folk, moral leaders, and other allies, we have power to do it. We are not just people that history can act upon. We are people who can act in history.
Absolutely so, Reverend. Look, when it comes to funding, because that is always an issue, how is this movement funded? I mean, there are a whole lot of rich people that claim that they really want equality and they really want a fair society. But yet it seems like progressive values, or those who are pushing the progressive values most people say that they want, have the hardest time getting funded. What's your solution to that?
Well, one of the things is, we're building out. We have some good friends and some people who give online, and some people who bring resources to the table. I will tell you something. My history has been, when we started Moral Monday, and 15 of us went in the legislature and demanded a change with an extremist governor, and they arrested us. We didn't even have bail money. We just went in because it was the right thing to do. I always believe that if you go with vision, somehow provision will show up. But you can't wait on provision to stand up for what's right. That you go to work. I'm a farm boy. I grew up on the farm. And my grandmother taught me, if you have a field that needs to be chopped, chopping is when you go out and remove the weeds. She said, go out and start doing it. And if you do it, somebody will see you what you're trying to do and come join you. I come from the school of Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune went down to Florida, Daytona, Florida. She said to her husband that the Lord had given her a vision to build a college, a training school for black students. She found a garbage dump and purchased it and started moving the garbage. And people said, are you crazy? She said, no, I'm not crazy. They said, you're never going to make that into a garbage dump, to a school. She says, I'm going to work and somebody's going to join me. And what happened? Wow. People came alongside her. I give you story after story. Frederick Douglass said the same thing after the Tanner decision of the Dred Scott decision. He said, this decision, as monstrous as it is, must intensify and embolden our agitation. So when we did the moral revival in 2016, we didn't know how we were going to get to the next city. But what we knew is that there needed to be a moral revival. Right now, I can't tell you every piece of resources we're going to need to go. But what I do know is we have to stand up, we have to rise up. And I'm a person of faith, and I believe that vision draws provision. Now, on the other side, on the government side, we don't have to raise any taxes to do what we're talking about. If folk pay their fair share, if we just took 10% of the current military budget, and by the way, our own military budget, if you cut it in half, would be more money than North Korea, Russia, Iran,
combined,
China combined, even if we cut it in half, right? But if we took 10%, but on the flip side, we don't have to do that. If you pass a living wage, then that's going to, there are metrics that show
it'll increase the economy.
Healthcare, public. Bam, there you go.
But Reverend, you made my day when you said you step out, you go do it, expecting that because what you're doing is, I gave up a whole lot for activist progressive journalism, and I tell you, happier doing the right thing, but sometimes worried that and you made my day when you said that you step out and do it, knowing that ultimately it's going to be there. The necessary resources will be there. My last question, Doctor, is the one I ask everybody. What should I have asked you that I didn't ask you, or what would you like to close with?
Well, Pacifica, first of all, I want to thank you all because you all have been there. You carried the mass moral march and assembly on Washington, D.C. last year. I hope in June 15th you all will carry it again. I hope that you will push out over and over again March the 2nd, and on all of your online platforms, we have a promo that's about 5 minutes. It's featuring poor and low-wage workers. I would ask you to push that out, and I'm asking that you all will tell people, go to the website, www.poorpeoplescampaign.org, or go to www.breach repairers and click on March the 2nd, wherever you see March the 2nd, find your state and join us. We gather at 10 o'clock. The assembly starts at 11. This is not a march. It's a launch, Launch. We're launching. And let me tell you how powerful we are in very simple terms. This is the last thing. Somebody said, well, how are you going to reach 15 million people? How are you going to touch 15 million people? 15 million poor and low-wage workers? I said, well, you do the math. If you have 30 states and you organize 200 people and you train those 200 people on how to reach people technologically using the old way of walking the turf, social media, then those 200 people reach 50 people a day. And you do that over 10 weeks and you have 230 states, that's 6,000 people. You will reach 1.5 million people a week.
Wow. Yes.
In 10 weeks, you reach 15 million.
There you go.
Which means over 40 weeks, you can reach them 4 times.
Wow.
So the numbers, it's not, some crazy number. It's just, you got to get a remnant of people. Mm-hmm. We're looking for 6,000 people in this nation who will join us. Out of 300 some odd million people, we want 6,000 people. 200 per state that will be willing to be trained in how to touch people in those states.
Reverend,
and we are together.
We are going to get there, and I guarantee you, Politics Done Right will do its part. Pacifica will do its part. KPFT will do its part. Thank you so kindly, Dr. Reverend Barber, William Barber, American Protestant minister, president of the Repair of the Breach and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, and of course, the architect of Moral Mondays. Thank you so kindly for having been with Politics Done Right.
Thank you so much. Blessings to you now.
As you know, I don't know how you do your taxes, but I have this Willies Media and, of course, the software company that I was placed in hiatus when I started doing activist journalism, and, of course, my personal taxes. And every year, it costs me quite a few dollars to go ahead and get TurboTax. That's what I use. but there are several other programs that people use to their taxes. Well, it costs money. And I always wondered, why should it cost money? Some people can't even use these programs that they pay for. They may actually go get a consultant to help them do their taxes. So given that the government is the one who analyzes what type of income you have, etc., whether you need to pay taxes on it, you would think that the government will have the program that they should give you to tell you how much taxes you owe them. So it's a logical thing. And it's something that shouldn't cost money. It's something that the billionaires, right, Jack? Something the billionaires shouldn't be making money off of. I make money off of you paying your taxes. I always thought that was crazy. A company sprouts up and builds a product, charge you for that product, purportedly to make your life easier to file taxes. And the government saw that that was a problem as well. So they decided to create a program, a free program for people who needed to file their taxes. Very logical. Nothing controversial about that. You think? Well, of course, the billionaires got to the Republicans, and the Republicans said, indirect file on day one, says House Republicans. In other words, they want to tell all of the people who don't use TurboTax because, again, either they can't afford it or, they just want to file their taxes. They say the billionaires told their slaves in Congress, hey, guys, we want to continue making money off the backs of the American people. Stop giving them that program that allows them to file their taxes for free. They need to pay the corporations to file their taxes. We need to make money on them filing their taxes. They want to make a piece of they want to turn every service into something that they can make a buck on. It turns out that this is what they said. In a December 10 letter, the lawmakers contend that direct file, which was piloted in 12 states during the last filing session, presents a conflict of interest for the IRS. I mean, that the things that these guys come up with, the IRS collects your taxes. In order for you to file your taxes, it's a complicated process because how many deductions you have, all that good stuff, right? So the IRS makes it simple by creating a program to make it simple, just like TurboTax thought to create a program to make it simple. Now they're saying it's a conflict of interest by the government for the government to tell you how much you owe. I mean, if it's laughable, it is completely laughable. And that they want now to tell, in effect, and this is where Democrats a lot of times fail, okay? Here we have Republicans telling Trump, as soon as he gets into office, to cut the program that allows the IRS to give filers a program to make their taxes easier to file. In other words, the Republicans are saying, let's apply a tax. Let's apply a tax to the American people to pay their taxes. Because when they could do it for free, because again, it's the government collecting your taxes, the Republicans are now saying, no, let them pay to file. Let these corporations that make a bunch of money on each one of you tax filers, let them continue to make the money. I mean, can you see this, folks? Can you understand what's happening here? This has nothing to do with conflict of interest. Nothing to do with conflict of interest. It has everything to do with them telling you that you have to pay to get your complicated taxes done. And now the DOGE, which stands for Department of Government Efficiency, they want to look that up as, hey, that's an expense we can cut from the government. In other words, no, they're not cutting that expense from the government. They're taxing you. So I have a message for Democrats. If the papers were turned, by now, there would be ads on air. The Republicans would be running ads on air right now, telling you that the government is taxing you to pay your taxes. And you know what I hear from Democrats? Crickets. Do you want to know why why the party with failed policies win? Because you don't have folks out there informing Americans of the predatory nature of the Republican Party and those who support the Republican Party. So people who are in fact Republicans don't realize that their own party is screwing them. Can you see that? Again, the government gives you the free the website so that you can file your taxes free of charge on the website, but they don't want that. They want TurboTax and all these other software companies that sells you something to file your taxes to make it easier. But I have something for them. Here's what they say. It's less efficient. Well, they forget that for TurboTax to automatically file your taxes, they have to have a gateway to the government computers. You know, when you use TurboTax and it says, are you ready to file? And you say yes, it calls up the government computer, transmit all that information to the government computer, and then the government goes ahead, hits computer, fact checks that stuff from TurboTax, and then says, okay, TurboTax, we accept that filing. Here's what TurboTax is telling you. TurboTax is saying it is okay for the government to spend money to create a software interface to work with TurboTax and all these other platforms, instead of saying we don't need to create that gateway. We just have to present it to the people who are the ones actually paying the taxes. We don't need a middle person. We don't need a middleman. We don't need a middle woman. We can actually go directly to the taxpayer and say, taxpayer, fill out these forms to pay your taxes. It is amazing. It is amazing the thievery sanctioned by our Republican legislature, or the thievery attempted by our Republican congressional house. But you know, it is amazing because when I talk about that party having the proclivity to screw its own, again, they are taxing both Republicans and Democrats when they go ahead and say, kill the program and let TurboTax make a whole bunch of money on you, right? So here we go. The second story that I had today, going to show you how corrupt these guys are. The second story is the USPS challenges already being tested. And in this article at the Daily Kos, what is really happening is in order to make the Postal Service more, in their terms, efficient, what they mean is make a profit. They want to go to the least profitable areas of the Postal Service. Okay, folks, you remember when you saw the election and you saw the map? The map looked very red. The map didn't look very red because most people are Republicans. That's not why the map looked very red. The map looked very red because in those red areas, in most of those areas, only a little bit of people live there. So you have if County A looks red, the reality is there are few people in County A. Then you have a little county called Harris County, and it's blue surrounded by red. In that little Harris County, there are a lot more people than just everything around it. Okay? So what you have is the Republican voter in the aggregate. They are scattered all over the country in small areas. But here's the kicker. The Postal Service charges the same amount to send a letter to Timbuktu, Yoakum, Texas, or next door to Houston, Texas. All right? Same amount of money. So in other words, those of us who live in Houston, Texas, are subsidizing the letters that go to Yoakum, Texas, because it's very small in Yoakum, Texas. And I'm just using Yoakum as an example. It's very small, and, you know, having a complete mail-in program, the truck going out, burning gas, all of that, to service a small amount of people is inherently inefficient. That is inherently inefficient, but we do it. Why? One, the Constitution says we should. But secondly, because, again, you know, we want our country to be connected. We want our country to be connected. So we make sure that everybody pays the same amount to send a letter to keep us connected. Of course, we use the internet now, but you get the drift. What does DeJoy and the corrupt folks want to do? all those little post offices in those little towns, they either want to close them or they want to make sure that they don't have to get deliveries every day, or one of these things. In all these rural areas that we're again, it's inefficient to deliver mail. They want to do something about it. But I want to recall something else that we spoke about yesterday. Whereas UPS already doesn't go to these rural areas, FedEx already doesn't go to those rural areas, the United States Postal Service does. And guess who uses the United States Postal Service to deliver their mail to the rural areas, to deliver their packages to the rural areas? The good old post office. That good old post office that people think they should hate because a lot of folks are telling you to hate them. No, no, no. Even UPS uses the United States Post Office to deliver their last few miles on packages in Timbuktu, America. And now they want DOGE, Department of, it's not really a department, but of efficiency or whatever the hell they call it. Now they are talking about, hey, now we can cut down the United States Postal Service, get rid of those rural areas. So folks, the people who vote for these people are the ones that they're going to screw themselves. You voted rural America. You voted for people who are talking about, guess what? Making sure your deliveries are not on time, making sure you don't get deliveries every day. So they're taking services away from you. You voted them in. People you didn't care about voting for. They're fighting like hell right now to try to make sure all of you get your mail on time, to make sure you get your services. But the people you voted for look at you and say, it's not efficient to deliver to you. Support for this show, Politics Done Right, comes from politicsdoneright.com, publishers of How to Make America Utopia, Take Away the Economy from Those Who Rigged It, As I See It, Class Warfare, The Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom, It's Worth It, How to Talk to Your Right-Wing Relatives, Friends, and Neighbors, and other books written by Egberto, Willies. Welcome to Politics Done Right. I am your host, Egberto Willies. This is a progressive program that will take the mystery out of politics. This is the program that will encourage you to make sure government becomes we the people. Whether you are liberal, progressive, conservative, or otherwise, you get to air your point of view. We are an independent media outlet that, unlike mainstream media beholden to corporations, we only owe allegiance to you. Remember, you can also send me a tweet at EGBERTOWILLIES. That is at Egberto Willies. Let us engage. It is Politics Done Right.